I'm going to call the City Council regular meeting of Tuesday, March 5th, 2019 to order. Madam City Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Mayor Christy Malchow.
Present.
Deputy Mayor Karen Moran. Councilmember Tom Hornish.
Present.
Councilmember Jason Ritchie.
Present.
Councilmember Chris Ross.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart. Here. Councilmember Ramiro Valderrama.
Present.
Okay. We do have a quorum present. Councilmember Stewart, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
Absolutely. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, I would entertain a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Councilmember Hornish.
I would like to remove item, I don't have it in front of me.
Item,
Human
yeah.
Services, is that item number 2? Is that right? Okay, item number 2 to remove.
Okay, item
Second.
number 2 from consent will be removed, and we will tuck that under unfinished business. We can put that after the stormwater code. Okay, any other changes? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of the agenda as amended, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, the agenda as amended has been approved. Next, we have public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to address the council. 3-minute limit per person, or 5 minutes if representing the official position of a recognized community organization. If you would like to show a video or PowerPoint, it must be submitted or emailed by 5 p.m. end of business day to the Deputy City Clerk, Lita Hashey, at I'll spell that for you just so you have it, LHACHEY at sammamish.us. Please be aware that council meetings are videotaped and available to the public. Thank you. Okay. First, I have Lindy Beringer, followed by Mary Wichter. I'm not sure your microphone's on. Is it on?
Hello.
Yep, there we go.
There you go.
Wonderful.
John Titcomb and myself live at the mouth of George Davis Creek.
Can we get an address just for the record, please?
Pardon?
Address for the record, please.
629 East Lake Sammamish Shore Lane Northeast.
Thank you.
We have met with Sammamish city people and are on record for cooperating to have kokanee reach the mile habitat above our property. I'm here just to register my voice of apprehension at not being at the table for decisions you make affecting the stream that we have made fish passable 8 years ago on our property. We've made fish passable from the mouth to the edge of our property. There are proposals, and we've had input into them, but I just have concerns about not having more input at the table to decisions you, the council, will be making. That's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Hornish, did you have something?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay. Mary Wichter?
Hello, my name's Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish, and I'm speaking on part of what I emailed today regarding inputs for the direction for the Stormwater Code amendments, which is item 9. The first thing I want to say is critical drainage areas, by definition and what they're set up for, they should always have a drainage review. It should be at 0 square feet. That's been in King County since 1998, 2005, 2009, and 2016. Landslide hazard areas became critical drainage areas in 2017 due to problems and adverse impacts, and that's where they belong. I do believe that bifurcating the stormwater code for areas around the lake, which are usually 5% or less, versus geohazard areas, which can be 5, 10, 15%, or even 40% or more, does make good sense. Landslide hazard areas do not receive the same protections as erosion areas, and Deputy Director of Community Development David Pyle had actually mentioned one time, he said, what we really need to do is make geohazard code that would include erosion, landslide, steep sloped areas, and steep slope hazard, and potentially seismic as well. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You could start off with what's already written for erosion. And there are indeed hazards in areas, particularly in where I live, that are known to the city. They've been studied, and they will be continued to be adversely impacted until CIPs or other facilities or appropriate discharge locations are available. And the council can direct the director, and the director can recognize these and not allow development or have special exceptions or exemptions for these areas in the meantime. Drainage review is needed because when you have cumulative impacts, they have to consider the full build-out conditions, and that was considered and adopted and required by NPDES as part of the King County 2016 Stormwater Code. Drainage review is needed to ensure adverse impacts are avoided and mitigated. Originally, there was a 500 and then maybe a 1,000-foot threshold, and then everybody said, let's use a percentage. The percentage maybe you should try using for non-critical drainage areas is 25%, not 35%. The 35% is a maximum impervious surface that I learned about through the King County manual, and that got misunderstood. So you should not be developing more than 35% of your property with impervious surfaces. Otherwise, you guys have to continually build stormwater and update it all the time. And if King County says you don't, use 4,000 square feet as a maximum. So those things already exist in code. I'm giving them back to you. Also, any changes you do for Inglewood can't impact adversely landslide hazard areas or other parts of the city. And those are areas that you also can't use low impact development infiltrating techniques in. Also, the interim development regulations have some play that's coming with this, and I've listed those, but I'm not going to talk about them. And then for exemptions, if you require drainage review and then you exempt people out of it, you are not requiring that cumulative impacts get dealt with. So there has to be a prioritized list or something that is considered or required for people to be, when they don't have to do fully things or have other things that they would consider. So I can't go through more now. I'm available if you want to talk, or I can work with staff. I've already met with staff. I think they're intelligent, can do a good job, so thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Is there anyone else that would like to address the council? Okay, seeing none, we will close public comment. I would entertain a motion for approval of the consent as amended.
So moved. Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor of the consent calendar as amended, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, the consent calendar has passed. Next, we have a proclamation. This is declaring our commitment to being a welcoming, inclusive, and caring community for all. And just for the public's edification, I've asked that each one of the council members read a section of our proclamation, and we will start at the end with Councilmember Stewart.
Whereas today more than 43 million foreign-born residents live in the United States and are contributing to the vitality of our country and their communities, and
whereas King County has an immigrant population of more than 500,000, and that 1 in 4 residents of the county are foreign-born, and
whereas fostering a welcoming, inclusive, and caring environment for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, ability, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or political ideology, makes our communities safer and more economically vibrant. And
whereas we firmly believe that hate has no place in our cities or anywhere in our country, and
whereas our joint commitment to providing a welcoming, inclusive region and embracing our area's diversity is a core value and is enhancing the broader community's relationship with all of our residents.
Now, therefore, be it proclaimed that we, the City Council of Sammamish, do hereby affirm our commitment to being welcoming, inclusive, and caring communities for all.
Be it further proclaimed that 1, we will continue to work together to ensure that every resident has the opportunity to thrive, and 2, that we reject bigotry in all its forms, including but not limited to racism, nativism, sexism, sexual prejudice, religious discrimination, and ageism, and 3, that we do not tolerate discrimination, hate crimes, harassment, or assault, or any illegal activities. And 4, that we will proactively work to protect the safety, security, and rights of all the members of our community. Signed, Christy Malchow, Mayor, today's date.
Thank you. Next, we have unfinished business. Our first item is a discussion of the Stormwater Code amendments. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, these amendments to the Stormwater Code were presented to you back in March of this year, so that's a long time back. So we bring it to you this evening. This is more of a presentation to, again, get this before you and get your thinking along that, and then we'll bring it back for action later on. So I'm going to turn it Tawny. I think she's going to walk you through this, so I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Good evening, Madam Mayor and City Council members. My name is Tawny Delzell. I'm the Stormwater Program Manager with Public Works. Tonight, I am bringing back to you the Stormwater Code amendments. Where we last spoke was, yes, truly in March of 2018. And after this short hiatus, primarily due to workload priorities, I am coming back to you with discussion on the Stormwater Code amendments. So tonight, what I'd like to do is review the background and your previous decisions, directions to staff, review what the issues are in the existing Stormwater Code, review with you your council direction last year on these issues, and then finally lay out the process and schedule on how to proceed with proposed amendments. I hope from this meeting the outcome will be that the City Council understands the background and what the Stormwater Code issues are, and that we can get, staff can and that council can confirm staff's understanding of your direction to us. And then finally, we need some additional direction on other identified thresholds. So starting with the background, you received an email from Ms. Wichter this afternoon laying out historically how we adopted the Inglewood Historic Plat back in 2014 and 2015. It's true there were a number of ordinances and temporary ordinances that went through council with a final adoption in 2015 of the Inglewood Historic Plat stormwater regulations. And primarily, it was adopted back in 2015 in order to address the flooding and erosion issues that had been occurring on or from these small lot developments. The ordinance required that drainage review be conducted when a threshold level reached 500 square feet of new impervious and replaced impervious surface. And it also required a tightline within the Inglewood area when that same threshold was reached, 500 square feet of new plus replaced. So at the end of 2016, the city adopted new Stormwater Code regulations in compliance with our NPDES permit at the time. What we did then was we adopted a new technical term of critical drainage area. And I'll expand on that definition later in the presentation. What we also did was we put specifically in the code that exemptions to the core requirements in the drainage manual were not to be allowed unless approved by the director. And we received direction from City Council at that time to not allow the director to provide these exemptions until we came back to the council. We spent the majority of 2017 reviewing the code and getting public input, specifically the code as it related to the Inglewood Historic Plat and these drainage review thresholds. Staff came to the Planning Commission in September and October of 2017 and we developed some recommendations in the Stormwater Code amendments. Late 2017 and early 18, council provided some directions on these issues. And these issues include primarily 4 items. Item 1 are the drainage review thresholds. Second one, exemptions and exceptions to the core requirements, Tightline exemption thresholds, and then finally, the Inglewood Historic Plat Ordinance. So item number 1, what is the issue? There are inconsistencies in our code. We have different thresholds for critical drainage areas, for landslide hazard drainage areas, and for the Inglewood Historic Plat. When we identified what a critical drainage area was in late 2016, we grouped together areas that drain to landslide hazard areas and called them landslide hazard drainage areas, and that's in the yellow that you see. And then we also added critical drainage areas to include areas that drain to Pine and Beaver Lake, and those are the areas in the purple. The area in red is what is the platted Inglewood Historic area. And on the drainage review thresholds, the City Council directed staff to investigate the use of a percentage of the total lot area. 35% was indicated at that time. And that was the trigger for drainage review in all critical drainage areas. So for example, a lot size of 7,500 square feet in green with an existing impervious surface of 2,500 square feet, existing house, may want to add an addition, a proposed impervious surface of 500 square feet. This existing plus proposed would be 3,000 square feet, and it would be greater than the 35%, which would trigger drainage review. So this is where some council direction is needed. When you look at setting a threshold for 35% on an existing lot, when you don't have an existing home or any impervious surface on the lot, you may result in developments occurring without drainage review. So in this example, the lot size is still 7,500 square feet. The existing impervious is 0. There's nothing on it but trees. You'd have a proposed impervious surface for a new house. For example, just under the 2,000 square threshold of 1,999. So when you add those together, you get 1,999 square feet, and that's below the 35% threshold that was directed to staff for drainage review. So we need to set another threshold for vacant and larger lots. Staff recommends a 500 square foot threshold of new impervious surface. There are other thresholds that could be considered. But this is something that we're looking for the City Council to provide direction.
Lonnie, question, can you say where you came up with the number 500?
500 is consistent with the Inglewood Historic Plat, and it also is consistent with many of the developments that we've seen who are just trying to add a patio, a small improvement to their driveway eaves. Actually, there's something that just came to my attention recently. A development permit wanted to expand their eaves by 32 square feet.
That would be for,
They can't do it without drainage review.
but that would be for an addition. What about if you have a whole vacant lot?
Yes, that would be for an addition. But if you have a whole vacant lot, it's still 500 square feet. If you wanted to, make anything on the lot, typically you wouldn't have any development on a vacant lot of if if you wanted to put a single family, I think the minimum would probably be 1,000 square feet, and we'll get to that threshold. But for a vacant lot, 500 square feet is what we recommend.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hornish.
So I'm trying to go back to the annals of my mind and this whole thing when it came up. But wasn't the issue in Inglewood, it was 500 square feet of new or replacement of current? And that was the issue. It wasn't an incremental 500. It was if you had 500 there and you replaced the roof, that required it even though it was already impervious. Is that right?
So it's and or, so you could and a roof actually.
What do you refer to it? The old one or what you're proposing?
The Inglewood.
The current Inglewood or what we had before
Yeah.
was and or, okay.
Yes. And this, what we're recommending is just new impervious surface. So it wouldn't include a replacement of a roof.
It would?
It would not.
It would not, okay. I wanted to clarify.
It would
that. Okay,
not.
Thank you.
We're good.
Okay.
Actually, I have a question.
Councilmember Stewart.
So why, historically, why was replacement of impervious surface ever included? So
I think that they were really just going back to the King County Surface Water Design Manual.
okay.
That required their threshold is 2,000 square feet of new and or replaced. So I think they were just trying to use that language. And I assume that the county was wanting to do retrofits of existing impervious surface that never had stormwater mitigation.
Do you see there being a reasonable reason for us to keep that in Sammamish, that there may be lots that never had appropriate drainage reviews, so it would be worth keeping that, or no?
At this time, no. We have, in the Inglewood area, as Ms. Wichter has pointed out, there are, about 50 vacant lots or so, but the majority, 80+%, 90% of Inglewood is built out. So to have a replaced requirement on top of that, and we've addressed many of the erosion and flooding issues with the Inglewood Hill Stormwater Project. To have that extra requirement on those properties who want to replace a driveway with an existing or a new bedroom addition, I think that is unnecessary mitigation when stormwater issues in the Inglewood Plat are mostly taken care of. We need to definitely address some areas in Tamarack and a little bit in the lower Inglewood half, but.
So would it be safe to consider if they're new or replacement, if a drainage review has not been completed since or by or something like that, so that if there are lots where that drainage review never adequately happened, we could make sure that a reasonable drainage review is done so that we can catch some of those issues?
That would be reasonable.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Staff recommends 500 square feet, but there is nothing stopping the city council from saying, and it wouldn't be a bad thing to have drainage review on all critical drainage areas. The negative side of it just adds cost to small single-family homeowners who are trying to do a very small project. And that cost could range from anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000.
Tony, can I ask one more question here? One of the items that Ms. Wichter gave to us is critical drainage areas have always had to have drainage review at any square footage level through the King County Surface Water Design Manual. Is that for just new, or do they do a new and replacement? Or
It's any.
any? Okay.
So previously, we didn't have critical drainage areas defined. We had that term out there, and we had adopted it from the King County manual, but there, in all intents and purposes, there were no developments in the city that were critical drainage areas until we passed the code at the end of 2016, which then we defined what that was.
Okay. Okay, so it wouldn't be unreasonable then if King County has always required it for the city then to require, I understand
No.
what you're saying, and
No.
it's a consideration for cost for someone building something, but, okay.
Absolutely.
Just wanted to get clarification. Thank you. Deputy Mayor Moran.
So my only concern would be is if we start, when you said the cost of $2,000 to $5,000, because I am all for having everyone checked. But at the cost of $2,000 to $5,000, I have to tell you, I can think of a whole lot of people that if they're building a deck are going to go, do I really need that permit? So I would just caution us very carefully on that.
I do have a question though on a deck. Is a deck considered impervious surface if it has slats where the water goes through?
It depends on what's underneath.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so, all right.
All right, I'll continue. And I will come back to this item 1 in the hopes of getting some direction. Item number 2, exemptions and exceptions to the core requirements. The issue before us is the code indicates that all core requirements in the King County Stormwater Design Manual, or our manual, our adopted manual, are required with no exemptions, regardless of size, unless they are approved by the director. The City Council has set some policy previously and has indicated to the director to not allow any exemptions. However, this may pose an unreasonable requirement for small projects, as we've talked about, that are not proportional to their true environmental impact. By governing by exceptions is not a preferred permitting strategy. So it may lead to some inconsistent decisions, perceptions of unfairness, and staff really prefers to implement clearly written code that can be reasonably implemented. And I give you this to make you squint your eyes, but just to remind you about all the core requirements that are required once drainage review is triggered, and all the core requirements that are required with no exemptions, no exceptions to them. They include from left to right, discharge at the natural location, that's the Tightline requirement. They include an off-site analysis by an engineer to tell us where the stormwater goes now and with development. Includes a formal flow control facility such as a tank, a vault, or sometimes a pond to be built. And we're talking right now about single-family residences already platted. They include conveyance analysis, financial guarantee, water quality requirements, and then LID requirements, flow control BMPs. So,
hold on, I've got one quick question. Councilmember Valderrama.
If you can go back to the previous slide to that, I understand that there is a hard and fast rule that you're looking at, but I guess 2 questions come up. How many discretions actually have been done over the last year?
yeah, so in March 20th last year, City Council allowed the Public Works Director to issue exemptions and exceptions that he felt were reasonable. We had 10 in that queue where they had applied in 2017 and they were waiting for staff to make a decision on the exemptions or exceptions. So that was a year and a quarter of processing a permit, waiting for decision to be made. So the council allowed the director to make that decision.
And the basis
And those
of that?
10, I've just spoken with our development review engineer, and of those 10, 5 have been issued with an exemption, 2 draining to Pine or Beaver Lake, and 3 in landside hazard drainage area.
But the basis for that were for the small projects not proportional to the environmental impact, correct?
That's correct.
Which is, I mean, that's the rationale that we didn't want to be so inflexible and to allow that. Okay, I just want to make sure, I'm trying to understand why we want to change that, given that. Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
So I appreciate that that we don't want it to seem inconsistent or unfair, and we also I don't think we want to put staff in a position where their judgment will be questioned. So I think that we can come up with kind of a triage checklist or a sequential or prioritized order of things that give a little bit of definition to that, where it possesses unreasonable requirements not proportional to it, right? We've talked about examples where, we don't want to require a vault where putting a vault in is actually going to create more environmental disturbance and negativity. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder there. Whereas there's probably a much better way to deal with the stormwater mitigations than requiring that. So I think that it is reasonable for us to ask you guys to come back with sort of what that list would look like, to say, look, if I'm assessing it, right, this is really just writing down the process that you would go through. Somebody comes in and there's this requirement and it seems unreasonable. What are you going to look at next? And you're going to go through a series of sort of questions and mitigation techniques, and you're going to go down that list and see what makes the most sense. And I think that makes sense for us to kind of formalize that and put that in there. I think we still will have to have at the bottom, well, what happens if we go through every single one of those and we still can't come up with something, then what? And I think that's what we'll need to give you that direction on. But I think it would be helpful not only for staff to have that documented, but for the public to be able to see these are the things that would be considered and kind of the order in which you'd be expected to review and assess those. So I think, to your point, we don't want to take that ability away from the staff, but we really want to be able to make it so that everybody's clear on what that process is and nobody can question anybody's integrity, because I don't think we want to put anybody in such a situation.
Councilmember Hornish.
To refresh my memory, if somebody were to disagree with the decision made by the director, is there an appeal process?
There is an appeal process. They can go to a hearing examiner.
It's not the final discretion by the director. It may or may not be the final decision.
Correct.
Okay. Can you go back to the slide of the 9 core requirements? I noticed real quick in here, I guess I hadn't grasped it before, but I see exemption in a lot of these boxes. So these, even though you say you're subject to all of them, there's still exemptions in the process of these core requirements for some things, correct?
No, City Council was clear that we were not to use any of these exemptions. These are the exemptions that are currently in the Stormwater Design Manual.
So we're not using King County, we're not allowing people to exempt out of this by using the King County exemptions. Okay, thank you. I needed to know that. Thank you.
All right, and so let me just talk a little bit about the rationale. We've touched upon on this, that putting in large detention and water quality facilities on small single-family lots are really difficult to site. You've got to put them in the lowest location, topographic location. And when you have an existing home, sometimes that is pretty difficult to site. When you excavate, you may be creating some unintended consequences like removing trees or adding to the risk of erosion. Property owners may not properly maintain these new facilities, and additional staff resources may be needed for inspection and code compliance. So, as a reminder, this is what I heard from the City Council on this item. the City Council wanted staff to bifurcate the critical drainage areas into two types: areas that drain to landslide hazard areas and areas that drain to the lakes, Pine and Beaver Lake. And this was because you recognize that the core requirements may apply differently to the different areas. And you asked that staff consider a couple of things, that requirements should not create greater impacts to tree retention and landslide hazard areas, and to use a percentage of the lot impervious surface as a threshold for exemptions, just for consistency. So this goes to a little bit about with what Councilmember Stewart has suggested, is we leave the language in the code that says there's no exemptions unless approved by the Public Works Director, and then add language in there that says the Public Works Director shall consider the following: impacts to trees, impacts to landslide hazards, impacts to water quality, as part of their decision-making process of approving exemptions. So my plan is to come back to you shortly with that list, so that the council can approve that, and it will be clear to the staff, clear to the public, where these exemptions would be allowed.
One quick thought. We have something similar, I believe, for Public Works already when it comes to things like sidewalks, right? We don't want them to have to put a sidewalk in and take out 5 significant trees in order to do that. So we've allowed for some motion of the sidewalk, or so there may be existing language that we can
Okay,
draw
great.
upon as well, too.
I'll look at that. Third item is the tightline exemption threshold. Tightlines are pipes that convey stormwater from typically the top of a steep slope to the toe, so that you don't have overland flow flowing down a landslide hazard area. Currently, there are no exemptions to the tightline requirement, so small additions and improvements would be required to build a tightline. And often, private easements are required through adjacent properties. And often, additionally, they're not granted, and the project is stalled or delayed. So what was the City Council direction? We understood that you wanted to use a percentage of the lot area again for setting one threshold. So an existing house with 2,500 square feet could put in an addition if they were less than that 35% of the lot area. But if they weren't, then they were going to be required to put in a tightline. So this goes back to drainage review thresholds. Another threshold's got to be set for vacant and large lots, because that 35% threshold isn't going to work when you don't have any impervious surface on it. Staff recommends an 1,000 square foot threshold of new impervious surface. That would allow a very small home to be built, and that would include the driveways. So a driveway, if you have a Hollywood strip or a modified driveway, it would be 200, maybe 300 square feet, given how far back a lot is from the actual paved road. So even with that, the impervious surface of the actual living space in a home could be anywhere from 700 to 800 square feet. But that does allow you to go up. So typically we'd have like a 3-story home, maybe with 2,000 square feet or 2,500 square feet of living space. Allowing any of that, 1,000 square feet, whatever threshold, Public Works would still want to approve an alternate system designed by a geotech engineer, so that we are not approving a development that impacts the landslide hazard area. There are ditches and culverts in some of these areas that do provide conveyance. That's not a tight line, though. So it does not qualify as a tightline. If they can convey to a ditch and a culvert system safely down to the toe of a landslide hazard area, this is something that we would want to investigate and possibly approve if they were to meet the 1,000 square foot threshold as well. That would be the staff's recommendation. There are future CIPs that the city can develop in order to mitigate for potential landslide hazard issues and still allow development. We plan to bring to you with the Zacus Basin Plan a series of CIPs that would address some areas within the Tamarack area, and that's going to be coming to you in April. So the City Council has the ability, and staff has looked at areas where tightlines can be developed by the city in order to help with impacts to the landslide hazard areas from development.
Couple of questions before you move on. And CIP, just for everyone, is
Capital Improvement Project.
just for those listening that might not know what that is. Councilmember Hornish.
I want to make sure I understand this slide. So if it's greater than 1,000 square foot of new impervious, I mean, as to what your understanding of our understanding, it needs to be tightline. If it's less than 1,000, no tightline, but you would still want to review and approve the alternate system for something less than 1,000? Is that what this slide is saying?
That's correct.
Okay, wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Last item is the Inglewood Ordinance. The issue is that there are areas outside of landslide hazard drainage areas that are still within the Inglewood plat area that are subject to the reduced thresholds and reduced or required tightline requirements. So we want to correct this inconsistency through a repeal of the Inglewood Historic Plat Ordinance. And the council direction then was you will decide once the other issues are addressed.
Tanya, sorry. I have a question as I'm reading while you're speaking, and it's back on your last slide. One more back. So the 1,000 square feet of new impervious surface, and that triggers a tightline. But are our landslide hazard areas incorporated into our critical drainage areas? And so are we requiring a drainage review at 500 square feet, or we're not?
So the 500 square feet, as staff has proposed for drainage review threshold, just puts you in the door for staff to take a look at, or Public Works to take a look at it.
But that's only in a critical drainage area.
It's only in a critical drainage area.
What about
Anything outside,
what about the landslide hazard area?
those are.
It's covered in there.
That's.
It's
so-
covered under critical drainage areas. A critical drainage
is.
area and a landslide hazard area are the same as far as,
Yes.
okay, just want to be sure.
Yes.
To be fair, it's a drainage to a landslide hazard area.
Well, there's landslide hazard drainage areas.
Yeah,
and
I
then there's
think-
landslide hazard areas.
Right.
It's a good point the mayor brings up is, let me look at a previous slide here. Oops, here. So in the orange is our mapped landslide hazard area, and then the yellow is the mapped landslide hazard drainage area, so the areas that drain to the orange. And it's come up in the past, well, does the orange landslide hazard area count as landslide hazard drainage? And my thought is that it does, because you have one drop of water in that landslide hazard area, you're also going to another landslide hazard area. So yeah, my thought that is it does apply.
And to the mayor's point, both of them are in critical drainage areas?
Yes.
Okay, just
Yes.
wanted to be sure. Okay.
It's a
And
Venn
is
diagram.
that language clear somewhere in code then, relative to this landslide hazard area and the landslide hazard drainage area? Because just because it's in your view, if it's not codified and somebody else is reviewing something, I just want to be sure everybody's on the same wavelength. Do we need to codify that?
We can make the code clear for
I
sure.
think we should.
It is codified what a landslide hazard drainage area is, and it says that areas that drain to landslide hazard areas.
Okay,
So, but we can make it clearer.
all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And including, that's easy.
So to update you on the process and the schedule that I'm committing to is that we will develop the code revisions, draft code language. We'll meet with stakeholder groups, focus groups, and review it with the city attorney, the code language, and bring it back to the city council on April 16th. And if the city council approves, we'll apply for SEPA, go through the Department of Commerce approval, and have hearings in June 18th for eventual city code adoption. It's a pretty fast schedule to bring this, but I recognize that it's been a year since coming to you, so this is the schedule that I'm going to try to meet. You've had some questions, and I have some questions.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, so one thing, I liked how you talked about, you guys want to develop that checklist. I feel like that list, though, that you called out, still needs to have some quantitative parameters in it, right? That it's not just that you're going to look at certain things, but, if you can't do a tight line, you're going to do these other things. And again, have something very quantitative there. And I do still think that we as a council need to provide direction that says there are going to be situations where they're going to go through all of the potential alternatives and none of them are going to be things that can be reasonably done. Then what? And I think that's something that we need to make sure that we are clear on what our direction there is. If you can't come up with a reasonable thing, does that mean that that piece of land is not buildable? Does that mean that some other action will be taken? And I think it's important that we account for all of those scenarios. The other thing is that I'm not sure if the 35% is the right number or not, and so we probably need to think about that. I appreciate also your, we don't want to make, like with the 500 square feet or the 1,000 square feet, make it too low because I don't want there to be a burden on people, but can we define that so that for that deck addition, we can make sure that that can happen reasonably without an additional $2,000 to $5,000, but for other things that would be more impactful, that we can still make sure we capture that. So I think it's really important that we strike the balance between, we don't want to create unreasonable burdens on homeowners, but for people who live in areas where the stormwater runoff can cause serious environmental impacts, I think it's important that we make sure that the right reviews are being done and that the right mitigations are being taken, particularly anytime we have anything that's draining into our streams and our creeks and ultimately into Lake Sammamish, because we aren't completely clear on what things are having impacts on the fish. And so until we really know that, I feel like we have to find a way to be as restrictive as possible without being completely unreasonable. And I know that maybe is not completely clear direction to you, but I think you understand kind of where that's going, is that, again, can we be more specific in the code that says there are these things, I want to add a deck and it has slats and, there's grass underneath or whatever, so that we can make it clear what can be exempted and the impacts are minimal. But otherwise, I really think we have to be extra careful in these critical areas. Just my 2 cents there.
Okay, maybe you should ask us questions because I don't have anybody else with a light on.
Well,
Oh,
I guess I'd like to go back to the issues where council direction is needed. So on the drainage review thresholds, Councilmember Stewart suggested that staff needed some clear direction on quantitative directions on when these thresholds or exemptions could take place. And this is one quantitative one that is laid out Is it 0? Is it 500? Is it 1,000? Is it 2,000? I don't think it's going to be 2,000 because that's going to be in our other areas that are outside critical drainage areas. But is there another number that council would like to direct staff?
And is this critical? This is only for critical? I just want to clarify.
Yeah, this is only for critical drainage areas.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hornish?
I was going to answer all 4 questions, but I'm good with 500.
So I have a quick question as it pertains to 500 square feet of new impervious surface when we're talking about a vacant or large lot and the impact of a drainage review on that. We're not talking about somebody building a deck on a vacant parcel. We're talking about them building a house, right?
Yes.
So I think somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 for drainage review is not a huge hurdle. I agree. It is. It could be a bar that's too high for someone doing a smaller project, but for someone building a house and a drainage review in a critical area, I'm not sure that 0 isn't a good starting place.
Yeah.
Councilmember Stewart.
Sorry, I thought you had more to say. I would agree for a new, if you're starting from scratch, I think if you're going to build a house, then in a critical area, you have to have a drainage review.
There's 2 questions.
Now, when you're talking about some sort of an addition, that's the question of what's reasonable.
So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. So a distinction could be that you use a 500 square foot threshold if you're just doing an addition to an existing improved lot. But if you're starting from scratch, if you have a vacant lot, let's just have you do drainage review. I'm getting a lot of head nods.
Hold on. So I'm scrolling back up because is it 500 or percentage?
So the percentage is always going to apply, and
Okay.
that's no problem with applying that percentage. But we do need something for
Okay.
vacant
I
lots.
think I like that. Then
Okay. Awesome.
it's on. Councilmember Hornish, I'm guessing you have 3 more questions to answer.
I was going to, I like that. So there's 2 questions in this first question. For if there's a current impervious surface and if there's none. And I would agree. I didn't quite grasp that, but if there's none, I would agree it should be 0 as a threshold. However, what do you define as current? If you've got something out there with an outhouse, I'm just going to say it. If it was 5 feet, if it was 10 feet, is that current?
I would suggest defining it as an existing single-family residence.
I'm okay with that, too. Okay, that's good.
Likewise.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
Is 35% the right percentage, or should we be thinking 25%? As the percentage threshold.
Well, I know that was Mary's suggestion in
Yep.
her email. I guess maybe staff can weigh in on what that translates to for somebody who's trying to do something.
The example that I provided is kind of a good example. That is the translation. The threshold would be 2625, and if you wanted to create an addition of 500 square feet, then you would be in drainage review. So even if it was less at 25%, so I'll just do some math here.
I think this is where we get into the suggestion of having kind of that matrix for staff to work their way through or checklist because, I look at 500 square feet and think about what somebody might be trying to add on to their home with 500 square feet. And much to the Deputy Mayor's point about a deck, there may be, something that someone can do where you don't put a bunch of crushed rock underneath your deck and create an impervious surface. Rather, you have something that is pervious potentially. But then we also have the issue where you might have a pervious surface under your deck, but you're in an area where LID or BMPs won't work because the glacial till soil that we have here doesn't drain, and so it runs off anyway.
Yeah, a good example of that is a lot of the homes that are on landslide hazard areas that have second floor decks, and there's nothing underneath them. They're kind of overhang.
Yep.
And that would be an example of it's not new impervious surface.
Right. Which is a good thing, and frankly, gives people some flexibility right there. And if you're just putting in a deck, you have the option to not put something impervious underneath it, and then you don't have to do, you're not causing that trigger.
And the other thing is, if you have existing impervious surface, maybe you remove some of that. Maybe you remove and convert your large driveway into wheel strips to allow you to build an addition. So it gives people options to build additions while not having the stormwater impact.
However, though, just playing devil's advocate with that idea, because I like that idea, but it would probably cost you more than the cost of the drainage review to tear up your driveway and put in something different. So in which case, somebody would probably just go ahead and do the drainage review, maybe.
But as you know, once you trigger drainage review, then all the core requirements are also triggered. So that could be more than the $2,000 to $5,000.
That's very true. Very true. Councilmember Stewart.
Just to be clear, we're saying it's either 500 square feet of new impervious surface or whatever this percentage is. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So one of the other points that Ms. Wichter has raised on numerous occasions is the cumulative effect. So 500 square feet on my property, not a big deal, but when me and 99 of my other friends do it, suddenly now that's, 5,000 square feet of impervious surface in a particular area. So how are we accounting for that? And then my second question would be, what about larger lots? So I guess if we have the 500, that's probably going to be the thing that triggers it. The percentage isn't going to all that often. I'm just wondering if I have a larger lot size, 35% might be something that I don't hit very often. But I think, and maybe again, to the mayor's point, this is where kind of getting a bit of a matrix so we can see what all of these different scenarios really are. So I've got a small lot. The 35% is probably going to keep me pretty hemmed in. 500 square feet is pretty small. If I have a larger lot, what does that really look like? And then since we now have this, if I'm putting a new house on it, I'm going to trigger it all the time. So maybe the percentage isn't as important now either. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of having trouble keeping track of all those different scenarios. So.
Yeah, when I put together a spreadsheet for myself using that 35%, and really it's that 7,500 square feet or less that would make it so that the 35% would trigger drainage review. Anything larger than 7,500 square feet, if you're doing anything more, then it would be the 500 square foot threshold that would trigger your drainage review.
And so that gets me back to this, I can see where having a smaller lot, you might need to be more restrictive because you don't have as much space around it, but it seems a little bit unfair that if I have a larger lot, I get to create, more issues potentially. So I just want to make sure we're kind of, again, implementing something that's fair across the board.
Okay, so I think I've got some direction from you that on existing vacant lots, you want drainage review automatically for anything that's proposed, and likely it's going to be a single-family residential home on existing vacant lots. For lots that do not have an existing SFR on it, the trigger would be 500 square feet or 35%, and you would like me to create a matrix for you to see whether it's 10, 20, 35%, what that would look like in triggering drainage review.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Deputy Mayor Moran?
I wanted to go back to the cumulative effect of for example, 4 houses at the top of slope doing, a clearing of 500 square feet. They're all doing something, all in one given area. What do we do? Do you keep some sort of track of that? What do we do? Do you keep some sort of track of that? Do we, what do we do? Do we, do you keep some sort of track of that? Do we, what do we do? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, what do we do? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do we keep some sort of track of that? Do we, do I mean, I'm just wondering, because I keep thinking about the cumulative effect of all of one area. And when you start thinking about the landslide areas, because I live in a landslide area, and I keep thinking about, you know, and I've seen some hillsides go in our area. So I'm wondering, do you keep track of that in some way? What would be the answer for that?
Yeah, I think when we look back at the history of what permits have been applied for and how many, we had 10 in a year and a half that had applied. We've had very little in this last year just because of development moratoriums. But when you look back at that history of 10 and you recognize that the city is also actively implementing basin planning and developing CIP projects, and the council has allocated budget for neighborhood drainage improvement projects, I think that we can address the issues that come up cumulatively before a major disaster, if you will, on that, because we're just not getting the numbers as rapidly as one might think in development permits.
Okay, the only reason I ask is when you see, as you get into the aging neighborhoods, and you see, for example, you know, the neighborhoods as they turn 20 or 25, and you get one guy who starts with the roof replacement, and you get, you know, the cumulative effect of that over the series of 2 years, where everybody replaces the roof. And then you get the decks that all have to, and I don't know how many years, as old as I am, I guess, but where you start having to replace the decks. And you see it, where you see the house by next, you know, house by house by house by house by house. Within a couple of years, everybody on that slope's going to have replaced that deck. And so I'm just wondering, you know, if we keep track of that, because it wouldn't surprise me to see, you know, a whole row of them go at once.
I can investigate ways for us to keep track of it. We have the Track It software now, and we're just trying to link that up to GIS. So we can do some investigation on tracking. But you say replaced, and that just triggers in my mind that these systems should already be capturing the stormwater when they were originally installed and mitigating for them. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
What about steep slopes? So we talked about critical drainage area is a landslide hazard area and a landslide hazard drainage area. What about steep slopes that aren't necessarily categorized as landslide hazards? Is there something we should be looking at there as well?
So currently we don't categorize steep slopes as a critical area like we do landslide hazard areas.
Should we?
And that was taken out primarily because landslide hazard areas are the critical areas. They have the potential because of their soils, not just because of their slopes, but because of their soils and groundwater that they might receive. Those are the areas that the city recognizes as critical areas.
Right.
And so when you add in and when you say steep slope, this is any slope that is 40% or greater. That is a steep slope, and they're everywhere in the city, not just from the plateau down to Lake Sammamish. So that was taken out. A lot of those steep slopes, if you will, were put in with road improvement projects or with other permitted developments.
I'm just thinking about if I live on a steep slope and the person uphill from me across the street adds, 600 square feet of impervious surface, while they haven't created a landslide hazard in any way, they might be washing out my driveway or my foundation. And so I don't know if there's anything that we need to be considering in the steep slope areas to, protect the development that's already there and not create even just creating flooding onto the roads or anything like that. And so again, I would look to you to make that call, but to consider if that should be included as a critical area, if it's 40% grade or higher, and you're doing more than 500 square feet of new impervious surface, does that need to have a review?
If it has a review, then we're going to be looking at potential flooding problems downstream and erosion problems. So if it does have a review triggered through our drainage review process,
Right.
then we would be looking at it. To classify it as a critical area, critical areas you cannot touch. You cannot do any development per our development code, not just outside of stormwater. So critical areas are wetlands, they're streams, they're landslide hazard areas. And to put in that steep slope area outside of landslide hazard areas, it would put a number of development restrictions within the city.
So if I'm trying to develop, so if I'm trying to add some impervious surface and I'm on a steep slope, while maybe it doesn't belong in the critical category, what are the thresholds that would require a review so that we make sure that we're not causing flooding downstream or downhill, sorry?
We're talking about the thresholds under this item number 1, and that would be the thresholds that we would use to trigger drainage review in those areas.
So this would apply to a steep slope as well?
It would.
Okay.
I'll just throw this out there. If you wanted to indicate that if you're in a steep slope or you're draining to a steep slope area, regardless of whether you're adding an addition or a new single family, then you have the authority to say that that trigger is 0. That if somebody was on a steep slope or drained to a steep slope 40% down to another property, then that trigger could be 0 as well, and not the 500 that we've talked about with additions. But again, I caution that it brings with it additional cost to homeowners, and it may not have very much environmental impact. I go back to 32 square feet of additional eaves on a home. In my opinion, that is not going to cause any additional environmental impact.
Mm-hmm.
I want to follow on, though, on that line of thinking. And I'm looking at the map, and I know I'm somewhat hindered on the map that you have in here because it's showing. I think
Can you specify what map?
Let's see. It's under item 1, drainage review thresholds. It's got the critical drainage areas on it.
Here we go.
And I know I can go in GIS and kind of look at this a little closer, and it's really fuzzy when I try and zoom in on it. But I'm looking specifically at Ebright Creek, where the landslide hazard area and the landslide hazard drainage area seem to taper off, even though I know the ravine is incredibly steep right there. And there may be some blue in there, but I can't really tell because it gets super grainy when I try and zoom in on it. But I think I know for development there's a buffer off of a creek like this. Correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say it's 150 feet. Is that right?
It depends on the stream classification.
Okay. Well, type 1 because we're talking about Ebright Creek here. So fish bearing.
Okay.
Is that 150?
I don't know the exact number.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So I guess the question is if you add a whole bunch of impervious surface and you live right next to the ravine, are we triggering anything by that, even if you're not covered in a landslide hazard or landslide hazard drainage area? Because according to this map, it doesn't look like it is, but it should be.
Yeah, and the map is for reference. Whenever we have a development application, we will, and if it's kind of on this border.
Or even if it's like, hey, I want to put a deck on the back of, or a new patio.
Yeah.
Same thing or not?
Yeah, same thing.
Okay.
Anytime we have work building something on a property, then we would take a closer look at site-specific conditions. Does it drain to the steep slopes along Ebright? Yes, then you're in a critical drainage area. So the map is for reference.
Okay.
When we're kind of on the border, when we don't know, and we have the ability to zoom in quite a bit on this, but if we're on the border, we would look at site-specific conditions.
Okay. And the reason I bring Ebright up and the ravine specifically is that, I think it was in 2011, there was a landslide into Ebright Creek because we had a development right on the ravine. There's the Fraser property, and there was a slide into the creek there. And of course, the city is doing a ton of work for all of our kokanee salmon-bearing streams. The last thing we want to do is to not cover ourselves on drainage review here that could potentially in the future lead to another landslide hazard into one of these streams, especially something like Zacchaeus, where we've just spent a ton of time and money restoring the stream bed. You do not want to send all that sediment straight back down and undo the work that we've done. So that was kind of where my head was going on that thought process, because a lot of these creeks do have really steep ravines. We were just up in George Davis, and there are steep ravines there as well. So that's kind of what I was thinking.
Okay.
That makes sense where I'm going with that. I just want to make sure that we're covering ourselves.
I still need that direction from the city council, and I thought I had it, but
And we confused you because we asked a whole bunch of questions.
but now I'm hearing from you that that 500 square foot threshold for new additions may be too high. That your city council may not be comfortable with that threshold for any new additions.
I think it's more of a question to you, isn't it? Of on a steep slope, what do you think, or what, not just you, but you collectively as staff think is a reasonable threshold where we don't create problems? Again, we don't want to create undue financial burdens on people, but at the same time, we want to be prudent about not creating environmental issues.
From what I've seen on the development applications so far in the city, I would still recommend 500 square feet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Stewart.
Sorry, one last question on the steep slope. Would we include the zero threshold for a new single-family home or any development on a vacant lot? Would we include steep slopes in that zero threshold? Was that your intention? To do a drainage review?
So often the steep slopes are in landslide hazard
Often, but
drainage
not
areas.
always, right?
Yeah, I can't say always, no.
Right. So I'm just thinking,
yeah.
if it's a steep slope, if it's 40%, I mean, that's a serious grade. If you're putting a new house or a new development on a 40% grade, I feel like a drainage review would be prudent to understand the downhill implications.
We can add that. If
Yeah.
yes, add it.
Please.
Okay.
Okay, I don't have any more lights on. So do you have questions for us on the rest of these?
One more. This Tightline is a question.
Get guidance on two?
I think I did, unless you guys, unless the council indicates that I didn't have a clear understanding of what you wanted me to do with exemptions and exceptions. I'm gonna create kind of a list of when exemptions and exceptions could be considered by the Public Works Director.
And what's to be considered?
Yeah. So just on this threshold for Tightline. I think what I'm hearing a lot from the city council members who have spoken is that there's a lot of discomfort in allowing developments to happen without Tightlines, at least in our current state of the lack of Tightlines on landslide hazard areas right now. So, so with that, we do need to address what happens when we still require them to build Tightlines and they can't, and so they can't develop anything on their vacant lot. That's something that I can discuss with the city manager and our legal, our city attorney, and kind of bring that back to you.
I think that might be helpful. I mean, I recognize that in order to do a Tightline, you've got to get easements from downhill property owners, and therein lies the issue for a property owner who can't do it. And my understanding is they're also quite costly.
Yes.
So, and that maybe it might help to understand too. I know we talked a little bit about our CIP and the fact that we did some work over in Inglewood, which will help there. But if we have future CIP projects through the Zacchaeus Basin that we're going to identify, that may help as well, because that would then, to some degree, in theory, could take the burden off of property owners that had to do a Tightline. They can tie into something that the city is going to propose potentially in a CIP. Is that fair or not?
That is fair, and the process, and the city attorney could help me with this, but the process would be that there is a moratorium until the city builds that Tightline system, and then they can connect to it. Very similar to the temporary ordinance that we had in Inglewood, where the code essentially set a moratorium on building until that Tightline was installed. So we could leave the threshold at no exemptions, and so anytime you develop in this area, you'd have to build a Tightline, and then that would essentially limit a lot of development.
Do we know how many lots there are in that Zacchaeus Basin where the city is looking at potential future CIP projects? Undeveloped lots, vacant lots.
No, I don't know a good number.
I mean, I know
you.
there's several, up in the town.
Ms. Wichter has identified about 40, if I remember from her email, about 40 in that that area between Lewis Thompson and Northeast 4th Street. So there could be about 40. But yeah, so unless I'm hearing anything different from the city council, what I'll do is I'll go back with the city attorney to see what the city's options are if we were to indicate that a Tightline is required on all of these developments, regardless of any exemptions in the existing code, and then see what the city options are for those lots that cannot be developed. Where Tamarack is not in what is it called, a transfer development area, so they wouldn't be able to transfer the development rights. But that may be an option if we were to proceed in this direction. So I think that's what I'm hearing, unless anybody is wanting to discuss more about setting a threshold.
Councilmember Stewart?
So the one question I have is, so does that, I think it's, I guess my question is about this alternate system. Are there alternates that we could still consider? So when someone comes in and it says it requires a Tightline, again, could there be a list of potential alternate systems that could be considered that would still mitigate the stormwater appropriately? And if an alternate system can be found, then I think that's okay. So it's not like you must have a Tightline or nothing. You must have an acceptable mitigation there. And so that's, I guess, something that I think we might still consider if there are other options there. Now, I don't know, maybe there really aren't any other viable options, but I don't think we should rule out other reasonable.
Okay.
Is that?
Are there other options?
Well, I spoke of one, especially in the Tamarack area, and there are also areas in the Inglewood that have ditch and culvert systems that would safely convey stormwater away from adjacent homes or adjacent infrastructure that Public Works would like to consider as an alternate system. Not everyone will work, but we would like to consider that as an alternate system to a Tightline.
Councilmember Hornish?
I'm going to go out on a ledge because I kind of liked the staff recommendation at 1,000 square foot for threshold. But that's why I asked the question earlier, but using an alternate system for something less than 1,000 square feet, because a ditch and culvert would have lesser impact. A smaller development will have lesser impact, and a ditch and culvert will most likely be more likely to be able to handle a smaller development than a larger development. So, you know, these are hard decisions, frankly. We, as the policymakers, have to balance the property rights versus the environment versus the potential damage. And I just think 1,000 square feet feels right to me as far as balancing all that for somebody who wants to develop and not too big, and they can use an alternate system to still manage the stormwater. So that I may be a singleton.
Councilmember Ross?
So to be clear, kind of following up on Councilmember Hornish's comments, an exemption for a Tightline is allowed if it's 1,000 square feet or less, say a vacant lot. To have an alternate system, you would have to trigger the Tightline requirement over 1,000, wouldn't you? Then you have an opportunity for an alternate system. But we keep talking in terms of less than 1,000 feet where a Tightline is not required in the first place.
No.
So it's kind of counterintuitive if I'm reading it correctly.
So it's required, a Tightline is required for these developments unless they're proposing 1,000 square feet or less of new impervious.
Right, correct.
And that they have an alternate system that they would employ for that 1,000 square feet of stormwater that they would produce from their impervious surface.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's why it's not either or, it's an and.
That's why I asked the question earlier. I think the third bullet should be if less than 1,000, alternate system must be approved.
Yes, that clarification, if you could put that in, because
Thank you, I will make that.
Thanks.
And I'm sorry.
Okay. Councilmember Stewart?
I think this is where, when you're talking about alternate systems, where it would be good to have the list of what the alternates that would be considered and what the quantitative requirements would be. So a ditch and culvert system, if the ditch and culvert system can do blah, right, and you quantify that. So again, there's clarity for staff, there's clarity for the public that, you know, because otherwise I have concerns that someone's going to come in and say, well, I had, you know, somebody tell me that if I, you know, dig a hole in my backyard, that's a viable alternate system. And I think it's important that we kind of identify what those viable alternate systems would be and what requirements they would have to be considered a viable alternate.
Okay.
One additional question and or thought. When we talk about a ditch and culvert system as a mechanism for conveyance of water, I instantly start thinking about Tamarack because that's essentially what's there now. And in many instances, that doesn't work. And I don't know if those are instances necessarily of 1,000 or 1,500 or 900 square feet of impervious surface. But if you've ever gone up in the Tamarack area, there's plenty of ditches. There's culverts going under someone's driveway in some places, and then it just like comes out onto the street and then runs over Lewis Thompson and into Zacchaeus, right? That's not what we want as far as a ditch and culvert system for conveyance.
That is not. And so if we were to approve a ditch and culvert system, we would require them to analyze the capacity of the ditch, the inlet capacity of the culvert, so that that type of condition would not occur. And there are quantitative ways in order to analyze that capacity. So it may be that the ditch and culvert system is under capacity right now, but they make improvements to it where that could have capacity. And that is where we would work with them to do that.
That's kind of my point of the quantitative.
So let me ask you, just because I'm thinking specifically about, and I don't remember which street it is, in Tamarack, where you see the water is running down the road in a culvert, in a ditch. It goes in a culvert under someone's driveway, goes in another ditch, then it goes in a culvert, and then basically there's still an existing ditch and culvert way far away from where maybe a development's going to happen. Are they going to be required to fix the ditch and culvert way down here in front of someone else's property? Because what happens in Tamarack is literally there's a slope on the road, and the water just says, well, I'm not going here anymore, I'm going downhill, and runs across the roadway, which is not really the mechanism of conveyance. So there may be capacity in the ditch system, but maybe right where that house is, but then 1,000 feet down the road, it doesn't work anymore, and it just runs. Are they going to have to fix that over there as well?
Yeah, that's where the downstream analysis comes into play. So they have to identify the conveyance system, where it goes down, where it would go.
Okay.
And then they'd have to identify any problems with that conveyance system, and we would be able to have that authority to require them to fix that, because they would be contributing to that problem with their development.
Okay. Very good.
And I know which road you're talking about.
I'm glad you know it too. It drives me crazy. Okay, Councilor Stewart.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point of having the list of what the viable alternatives would be and quantifying what would be required to allow it to be viable, right? Which is, if you're going to create X amount of stormwater, then that has to have this amount of capacity. The analysis has to be done. You may have to add that capacity. I think if we can get very crisp on that, I think that will avoid all of those questions.
Councilmember Valderrama.
Yeah, Chrissy had raised an issue that went back, when you look at Tamarack and you see some of this overflow, and this was analyzed back when Lyman was the city manager, some of that was because the culverts on existing residents are not maintained properly to that point. In which case, then, does the city have the authority to go back and tell the people who aren't maintaining their culverts just to fix those and correct those ditches and other areas? Because that was apparently, when the staff went out there, one of the issues that we were looking at, and you can see it when you go up on those streets that isn't done. And I think that's part of what's going to take place, because if somebody's going to be looking at these requirements and it's going the road, but not because of what they're doing, but because of the neighbors, the city should have the ability to go back and say, hey, these neighbors have to also step up in maintaining their culverts. So that's my thought, and I don't know if that's currently envisioned or not.
I'll have to confer with the city attorney, but yeah, I don't think that we have legal authority to require properties to do maintenance on private property unless it is through a development application.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So if a development application says, hey, it's now, as Chrissy was pointing out, spilling over to the road even before I'm doing anything, but it's existing homes who haven't been maintaining it, does that trigger something within our system?
So the developer, or the person who wants to do something on their property, they would do a downstream analysis, identify problems that are off their property. And in the case of Tamarack, they all own collectively that private road. So they would have the ability to legally go in there and fix the problem. And we would require that with their development application. But you're talking maintenance, long-term maintenance, and that is something that I don't think we have the ability in our current code to require private property owners to maintain their private ditches and culverts. So, yeah, and I'll confer to the city attorney on that.
Okay. Mr. City Manager?
Madam Mayor, once again, we're working an issue here at the council dais. And what I would suggest, if you still have questions that we need to go through, that we roll this item over to your study session next week. The hunting regulations is coming off that agenda, because if we're going to go back and forth, we're already 20 minutes over this item, and you have some other big issues I know you're going to spend time on this evening. Now, if you don't have any more questions, I think we have the guidance we can move forward with, but if we need more discussion on this evening, I would suggest we move this back, and we'll be talking about which agenda these type items go on, because we shouldn't be working these here at the council bench.
Do you need more guidance from council on
Yeah, which one are you going to come
Item.
back with?
Well, it would be beneficial for you guys to give me direction on this 1,000 square feet or not. I've heard from some council members, but it would be helpful to have some direction on that threshold with the alternate system. Is that something that we want to pursue, or should we pursue what the city options are if lots are not able to be developed?
Both.
Both.
Yep.
Is there a vote or something that can take place?
I would suggest we pick one for a direction, but we can always
Yeah.
change it. But give them
I think
direction, direction to go to.
It has to be both, though, because what if they're below 1,000, but they can't come up with an alternate, then we still need to have what do you do? If I can't, it's below 1,000, I don't have a viable alternate, and putting a tight line in is not reasonable, then what is that? So I still think we need both.
Okay. I'll come back with both.
Okay, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Council.
Thank you. Do we want to take a break or keep going?
Yep, let's take a break.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break here. Okay, we're going to get back on track here. So we need to go, and we are going to do our consent calendar item number 2 that was pulled, which is the adopting of the city's human services strategic plan. So Councilmember Hornish, you pulled that off consent. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I would like to, given that I felt, and there were a lot of questions, I think, when we discussed this, what was it, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? I think there needs to be some massaging on it as far as to make sure that we move away from the inclination or the intimation that it seems like that we're becoming a service city and continue on with just the recommendations. And I just think that's going to take some more time. So I would move that we table that and rework it and to bring it back for council at a later time.
It's now been moved and seconded, so we can have some discussion. Councilmember Stewart.
Can you be more clear what you're asking? I'm not sure I understand what the problem is.
I don't want to rehash all the questions we went through when was it, three weeks ago we reviewed it?
Something like that.
But there was multiple questions.
There were.
That this is the same thing we reviewed that we had so many questions about that haven't been addressed yet.
Can I ask a question to Tom? But you had another comment in there, which I think I was on board with you, that about the service city that we're going to be tipping.
And I think that was part of the questions.
That's correct.
We were talking about why does it feel like we're becoming a service
Direct
city
service
when we
provider.
say we don't want to be a direct service provider.
Well, that's correct. And also that some of the points that were being covered were already being addressed. Like we said, the Arts Commission was doing activities, the Parks Commission was doing, and it seemed to be trying to move it into here to make sure that this reflects what actually already exists in the city and not trying to bring it back into a different area was the second part. So when they were talking about like cultural activities that are already spread out in arts, and then, okay, yeah, I'm with you on that.
Okay, I don't see any further discussion, so the motion is that we table this, and Mr. City Manager, then if, assuming this passes, then we'll probably need to get this on a study session, I would suggest.
And we may, let me get together, we'll take a look at those questions. I may have some calls that we need to talk with some of you about, and we may have that back to you next Tuesday.
Okay. All right, so all those in favor of tabling this discussion into a future date, potentially next Tuesday, say aye and raise your hand, please.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Okay, by a vote of 5-2, we will table that and hopefully see it next Tuesday then. Okay. So now we have the next item, which is a resolution approving the 2019 Budget and Work Plan Program for a Regional Coalition for Housing, also known as ARCH.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, we have some guests with us this evening, and I'm going to call on Ms. Leitner to introduce those guests to you.
I just need 1 minute to get the presentation up, sorry.
More time for everyone up here to eat snacks, apparently.
Okay, I'm
myself.
ready. Sorry about that. Good evening, council members. Tonight we're asking you to consider approving the 2019 work program and budget for a regional coalition for housing, better known as ARCH. And ARCH works to preserve and increase the supply of housing for low and moderate income households. And as a member of ARCH, Sammamish has to review and approve ARCH's annual work program along with the other member jurisdictions. So I'm going to direct your attention to my right so that I can introduce Lindsay Masters, who is ARCH's executive manager, and also give a shout out to Mike Stanger. Hi, Mike. He's the senior planner for ARCH. So Lindsay's going to be talking more about their work and then what they'll be focusing on in 2019.
Good evening. And then just click that right there, right? Yeah, okay, cool. So as Miriam kindly introduced me, I'm the new executive manager at ARCH. I come on board after a long tenure from my predecessor, who was kind of the founding manager of the organization. And so it's been a really great experience kind of picking up where he left off, including the work ARCH has been doing with Sammamish. So just a little bit about ARCH. I'll go kind of through a high-level overview of who we are as an organization, the ways that we work with our members, and then transition to the 2019 work program and budget. So ARCH is an interlocal agency. We were created in 1993 by a handful of East King County cities, and then several more cities joined on as members in succeeding years. And really the purpose of that coalition was to try to cooperatively plan for and provide affordable housing as a region. We are structured such that our governance really lies with our member jurisdictions. So we have an executive board that's comprised of executive level staff from each of those members, and that really is our governing body. That's where all of our decisions get made. In addition to that, we rely on city councils to annually approve our work program and budget. And that includes both the funding that supports our operations as an agency, as well as capital investments in particular housing projects. So typically, each year we would bring forward a recommendation for some funding in a recommended housing project. And that recommendation would only come to you after it has been vetted by ARCH staff, as well as ARCH's Citizen Advisory Board and ARCH's Executive Board. Briefly, just some of the ways that we work with our members. First and foremost, we do work to pool funds from each of our members into affordable housing projects across our region. A key component of that work is not only working with the developers of those projects, but also with other public funding partners whose resources are critical to leveraging those local resources to make projects happen. Housing policy and planning is a significant area of work for us. So we have worked over the years to put in place housing policies and to support planning efforts for just about all of our member jurisdictions. Example here is we've supported housing strategy plans. We also support work on housing elements within comprehensive plans. And really, we also try to be a voice for East King County jurisdictions in regional efforts. An example being the recent Regional Affordable Housing Task Force that was a county-wide planning process. Another key role that ARCH plays is that we help jurisdictions to administer housing programs. And that's really, after you've done the good work of setting up a policy or a program, there's some follow-up implementation and administration that's needed. So ARCH is able to support you in that process. And I should just note a key part of that too is not just setting up the initial affordable housing agreements, but also monitoring affordable housing projects over the long term to make sure they remain affordable. Finally, ARCH does a fair amount of education and public outreach. We try to look for opportunities each year to host educational events, such as tours of affordable housing, or recognition events to highlight exceptional housing projects. This is a quick snapshot of high-level impact of the investments that have occurred in the last 25 years through ARCH's Housing Trust Fund. There's been a total of close to $63 million in local funds that have been pooled. Those funds have gone on to leverage $9 for every local dollar of funding to create the approximately 3,600 units that you see represented in this table. This is a map of where those projects have been located. ARCH has always held as a high priority to have equitable distribution of affordable housing throughout the region. I believe we've had a couple projects in Sammamish that have received investments from the Housing Trust Fund. This is a picture of affordable production through city incentive or inclusionary programs. And this is it's notable because I think East King County had some very early adopters of those programs when there weren't a lot statewide. And so ARCH was pretty much ahead of the curve in getting those programs in place in many cities. And we're fortunate today that now there's been thousands of units created through those programs. And really what you see here is that the production follows the general development activity. So in the recent years where there's been a major increase in development, we've been able to get an increase in affordable unit production. So our work program is a fairly lengthy document that you have before you, and we intend to continue doing many of the things we've done in the past across those 4 topic areas that I just highlighted. But we also wanted to elevate some priorities for this year. So we had a discussion with our executive board about what would be those key priorities for the year. And so what we landed on was we would really try to put a focus on strengthening those program administration and monitoring functions. And just noting that the size of the portfolio of affordable units that have been created through ARCH and its member jurisdictions has really grown, and it's to a significant scale, so it's a good time for us to focus on that. In addition, we want to spend a lot of time and attention on facilitating transit-oriented development projects. And this really is the opportunity that's created by having publicly owned land adjacent to new transit infrastructure. In addition, we want to spend some time thinking as a region and also helping jurisdictions to think about developing dedicated revenue sources for affordable housing. And finally, we want to take some time to understand who is accessing the affordable housing that's being created through all these efforts, whether or not we're reaching underserved communities, whether we need to think about some proactive outreach strategies. So that's the highlights for the work program in 2019. And finally, we have specific activities highlighted for work with the city of Sammamish. And as part of developing our work program, we reach out to every member city and we ask them to identify what are the activities they have as their priorities in the year. And so this represents some of those for City of Sammamish. And I welcome any questions.
Councilmember Hornish.
So can you let me refresh my memory, the funding allocation amongst the members for the operating? There's 2 funds. It's the trust fund and the operations, right? Mm-hmm. I always get confused. Is the operations the ones that's based on population, commercial sales, or is that the housing trust? You know, it's a whole formula. Which one's which?
Yeah, that's a good question. The operating budget is based on population.
Only?
Yes, population
Okay.
only.
But the trust fund is then based on all these other parameters, how much commercial you have in the city and
Yes.
sales. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Well, actually, I got another question.
Okay, go ahead, because no one else has their light on.
So can you go back to the last slide there? As to the specifics that you're working with here in Sammamish, the first one's pretty clear. I wanted to better understand the implementation of the town center affordable housing provisions. How do you envision that working with Sammamish specifically?
So really that would be where your local codes require affordable housing as part of a development.
Or incentivized, or
Or through
as
an incentive. Mhm.
Okay.
We would be working with you and with the developer to create an affordable housing agreement that implements those conditions.
Okay.
And so it would set out, you know, the restrictions on income and occupancy, and that would be a restriction placed on the property and recorded, and then monitored over the long term.
Helpful, thank you.
I don't see any more questions. But I am scrolling back up because I think we need a motion from someone to adopt the resolution.
I'll move to adopt the resolution as proposed in our package to approve the budget and the work plan.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor? I'm looking for the language on the resolution. For the resolution for Arch's 2019 budget and work plan program, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, the work plan is approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You missed the thorny issue.
Yeah, it must be
As opposed to April 30th, how about?
Whoops. There we go. Next, we have council reports and committee reports. We have 2 provided here. I think all of us, well, I don't know if all of us have, but I think many of us at this juncture have met with Republic Services. Has everyone had a chance to meet with them at this point? Yep. Okay, so everyone's aware of what's going on there. Mr. City Manager, have you had a chance to catch up with Republic Services, and are they due to present to us more information and as well as to our residents?
They do. They have some information they're putting together, and when they have that ready, they'll let us know. I think I saw them on the long-range calendar here. I need to confirm that is actually the date that they will be coming, but they still have some background work they need to put together before they come before the council.
Okay. And for those watching, Republic Services is responding to the China sword policy, which has to do with contamination of recyclables and the markets that have shifted significantly since the China sword policy went into place. They are having to find different markets, therefore their cost burden has gone up, and they are looking to Sammamish for input on that. So we will have more on that at a later date. I think that's all I had, except for the one thing I forgot to put on my report was the fact that I got to walk up George Davis Creek with some of the city staff and as well as King County staff. It was really nice to see the project from all the way from Lake Sammamish, and we hiked, I don't know how far we walked up into the creek. 1 mile, Tanya says, we walked 1 mile.
Felt like 10.
Yeah, it was a workout. There were a lot of log jams in there we had to crawl over, and so it was good. And I appreciate staff, both on the city and county side, as well as David Kyle from Trout Unlimited was there hiking in there with us too. So anyway. All right, so let's move down to, I think we have Councilmember Stewart anyway at the end of the dais, and that works well because her report's on there as well.
Excellent. So again, I just included in my report about our peace rally, and my apologies to Council Members Ross and Councilmember Valderrama for not including you and thanking you for attending that peace rally as well. So
Where's
my apologies.
picture?
I did not mean to leave you out, but that was a wonderful event, and thank you to Christy Riley and to Platopians for Peace for helping to put that together. The mayor already talked about Republic Services. If anybody wants information on she referred to it as the China sword. It's China's national sword policy. For whatever reason in my report, it comes up as a black underline, but if you click on that, that will actually take you to an article that explains what that policy is. And last but not least, I attended the SCA GMPC meeting, which is the Growth Management Planning Committee or Council. There is, I think I've talked about this last time, there's an affordable housing committee draft charter and work plan. So there was an affordable housing study group or whatever, and they came up with recommendations on what to do to move forward for the county. This is an actual draft charter and work plan. We did had a meeting beforehand and caucused, and then during the meeting there was discussion around the membership and expectations for people who would be on that committee. There was also discussion around the Vision 2050. So the draft supplemental environmental impact statement was released on 2/28. There's a feedback period between now and April 29th. So I highly recommend that you go out and you take a look at that and you provide feedback. You can provide feedback as a citizen there. You can also provide feedback to me, and I will be taking that back. We have another meeting at the end of March, and we'll be providing that feedback there. Because the review period is very short, it may or may not be able to go through the PIC process, so we may be taking that feedback and trying to run it through the GMPC process to get that in there. And again, this is the Vision 2050. I included a pretty lengthy section at the end of my report that talks more about the draft environmental impact statement, and where you can get more information. There will also be brown bag sessions if you actually wanted to attend a session in person and get more information. But please feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or any questions on that. So there's two pieces of action that I'd like from you. One is to look at that affordable housing draft charter and work plan, if you have any feedback on that, and also on this draft environmental review statement.
Very good. Councilmember Valderrama.
No additional report.
Councilmember Ross.
Thank you. Today, Councilmember Hornish and I met with the Executive Director, Dave Meyer, of the YMCA, and he had a couple leaders, including the CFO, that had understandable conflicts, and we'll share that. But they were we're going to follow up with all three of them later this month. We reviewed the financial presentation, and we've identified, Councilmember Hornish and I, open issues and some follow-up items to be reviewed in our follow-up meeting. They have presented their annual report timely fashion, but we want to hold off presenting it to the public until we have tightened up clarity and transparency of the report for that meeting. So that's where we are on it. So it was a good meeting today.
Very good.
When do you anticipate that?
The public report?
Yep.
We're going to finish up probably our follow-up review later this month. So it looks like probably scheduling will probably be in early April.
Depends on if we have to go back and restate the prior years.
We
It's gonna take
have some
time.
potential restatements to present prior years, but yes. We'll see.
It may take a while. The restatements usually always take a while to go back and kind of redo them.
Yeah.
Councilmember Ritchie.
Just to restate what Councilmember Stewart said about the Unity event in Klahani after the vandalism. I've lived in Klahani for a dozen years plus, and I have never had such a great experience with members of the community. I want to thank the members of the council that came to the event, and it turned lemons into lemonade. It was a really, really good event for everyone that came, and I think we come out of that a stronger neighborhood and a stronger community, a stronger city. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Moran.
Well, I was in Hawaii, and I wanted you to know that I heard what you guys were doing all the way over there.
Was it raining in Hawaii? I hope. Dang it. Councilmember Hornish.
No additional report.
Okay. All right. City Manager report.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, you have at your place this evening a redrafted schedule of the city manager recruitment interview schedule. You'll see on the on one side it has kind of the activities both Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And on the flip side, it has the interview schedule both for the 101s and the panel interviews. There's a couple of ways that you can shorten this if you choose to. The first is you could opt not to do the 101s and split the panel interviews on Saturday and Sunday, and that would give you a chance if there was a candidate or two that you wanted to bring back for a second interview, you could do that at the end of that schedule. That would be one approach. The other approach would be on the panel interviews, since those go from, depending on the number of candidates you have here, 3 to 850, and then from that point you'll see on the other side you have your executive session and then a decision. You could take those two items and put it on your agenda on the 19th, make that decision there, so that would take something off the end of that. That is depending on the number of candidates you have. As you know, you lost a candidate today, and I am suggesting to you that you consider adding back candidates 3 and 6 to your interview schedule if you choose. That would give you 6 candidates total to interview, and then again, that's as we stand today, and it's always a possibility you may lose one more candidate before you get there. So that's just a quick look at what we have, and again, any alterations you want in that, we're glad to make, but if not, we'll try to stick with this schedule as we've given it to you here today.
Councilmember Hornish.
I didn't mean to, but I do want to. I like the idea of moving the executive session Sunday night and vote to the 19th. Just my thoughts.
Deputy Mayor Moran?
It's going to be a long day.
It is going to be a long day.
Are you done?
Yeah, my button's off.
Okay, well, I'd like to make a motion to add back in the two, since numbers 3 and 6, I believe, from last night.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion on that? Councilmember Stewart?
So is there any consideration of making accommodations for that other candidate to come at a different date? If it's just a scheduling conflict, so I don't know if that's something we want to consider as well. Not to give anybody special treatment, but it's just
Are
something
you
to
talking
think
about the
about.
person who dropped out?
Correct.
I think I think he asked to drop out, and that's it.
Yeah. Okay. We do have a motion on the floor, though, on adding back in candidates 3 and 6. So if there isn't any more discussion on that, all those in favor of adding back in candidates 3 and 6, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. By a vote of 7-0, we will add those two candidates back in. You need further discussion relative to the executive session and voting and moving that to the 19th?
We can stay with the schedule as is, or either of those changes I suggested. Again, we're open to try to make this a little easier on the council. It is a long day. I think you'll see, which actually is not all bad, you'll see a little fatigue in the candidates for this over, and that'll give you another perspective of them as well.
Councilmember Stewart?
So I'm not a huge fan of marathon meetings, but you did raise the concern that we will be on a pretty aggressive and tight timeline already. So if we were to move that to the 19th, do you feel like we'd still have enough time to get that, whatever contract negotiations we'd have to do so we could approve that on the 26th? I just don't want to put that in jeopardy.
Yeah, again, if you look at your long-range schedule, there's a couple of other meetings that we can do there, and Mr. Kenyon has indicated to me there's another approach that we can take that may help that, and that's putting together a term sheet, which we could do fairly quick, and then we could integrate that into a contract, perhaps. That may help us move that a little faster.
Okay.
I'd like to move, just to kind of bring it to a head, the 9 o'clock to 11 p.m. on the 17th to the 19th. Because, well, I'll comment afterwards. That's my motion.
Can you,
Move the
moving the-
executive session, dinner, vote, and close meeting from 9 o'clock to 10:30 and 10:30 to 11. That's on their schedule for March 17th to our
Regular meeting on the
March
19th.
19th.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion, Councilmember Hornish, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just think it's a long day, and I like to, in these processes, step back, sleep on it, think about it, so I like to have a couple more days.
So take a 9 o'clock.
So
Sunday the 17th.
we're moving the last two items on Sunday to Monday, to our, or excuse me, Tuesday, to our regularly scheduled meeting. Yes.
Dinner too?
Will it be refrigerated, though?
Not a good use of taxpayer dollars.
I don't want to.
Okay, so I don't think I see any more discussion on this. So the motion is to move those two items to the 19th. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, we will move those two items to Tuesday, March 19th. Okay, anything else on your city manager's report? That concludes that. Okay, we do have an executive session this evening for potential land acquisition pursuant to RCW 42.30.1110(1)B. How much time do we anticipate for that?
Let's say 2 hours, but hopefully we'll get you out there soon.
Very funny. Okay, really?
You will find this will be, this may take some time.
Okay, so but realistically, how long, so we can alert our audience members here?
30 minutes.
Let's do 1 hour.
Oh,
Do we anticipate action?
He doubled it for us.
I don't know. So 1 hour, do we anticipate
Yeah, that's right.
On the stormwater regs, more complicated.
Okay, so, but hold on. Do we anticipate action? Yes, okay, there will be action after the executive session. Just a second here, since he just walked back there.
We did? Oh, no. Oh, what?
Okay, hopefully he's ready to go. Councilmember Stewart?
Okay, Madam Mayor, council members, I move that we authorize the city manager to proceed with an administrative settlement and purchase a portion of real property on parcel number 33250697174 in the amount of $85,000 plus associated closing costs for the purpose of Southeast 4th Street Improvement Project.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, passed.
Okay, Madam Mayor, fellow council members, I move that we authorize the city manager to proceed with an administrative settlement and purchase a portion of real property on parcel number 332506928 in the amount of $100,000 plus associated closing costs for the purpose of Southeast 4th Street Improvement Project.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, that passes as well.
I have one more motion.
What?
I move to adjourn.
Third, fourth, and sixth. Okay, all those in favor of adjournment say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, by a vote of 7-0, we're opposed. We're adjourned. We're adjourned. It's too early. I can't speak those words yet.